Since the beginning of the Switch era, Nintendo has had a framework for their games. Some franchises fit within this framework better than others, but just about all of them have common attributes that make it up. A dense open-level format with environmental puzzles and combat encounters, short instance challenges with clear objectives and secrets, and significant freedom in exploration and movement. Most importantly, there is something to accomplish in any given direction and every few minutes to capitalize on the pick-up, put-down nature of the Switch. Donkey Kong Bananza takes this framework and turns it up to 11. It's extremely fun. It's fun on levels I didn't expect, and does certain things better than any other game I have ever played, some of which may be very surprising to you, especially if you are familiar with what Nintendo usually prioritizes when developing their games. Yet in other ways, it was incredibly disappointing, as if little thought was given to major aspects of the game.
But before we get into it, I want to be clear that this video is not a review. It's a critique. I'm going to outline the positive and nitpick the negative. At times, it might seem like the game doesn't have enough, that it doesn't satisfy me as an experience. But make no mistake, Donkey Kong Bananza is one of the best games I have ever played. Consider this your spoiler warning. I'm going to be discussing almost every aspect of the game in one way or another, whether it was shown in previews and promotional material or not, along with some details from the games on screen. This includes the ending, but that will be much later in the video and will have a separate and quite serious spoiler warning because there are some very cool things that happen that I don't want to spoil for anyone. Whether it be helping a Korok, finding a moon, or catching a Pokemon, you can expect to accomplish something every time you pick up a Switch-era Nintendo game, whether you play for 5 minutes or 5 hours. Bananza continues and refines this trend, and that shouldn't surprise you due to how much experience the development team has with 3D platformers like Odyssey. Which brings us to the first part of the framework that Bananza refines. Let's talk about movement. Donkey Kong Bananza has the best movement in any 3D game I have ever played, and that includes Mario Odyssey. I could even go so far as to say it has the best movement in any game I've ever played. But I do think games like Celeste and Ori and the Blind Forest have it beat when it comes to precision and fluidity, and those are unfair comparisons because it's a lot more complex to fine-tune 3D movement than it is 2D movement. Bananza has smooth and snappy movement with nearly perfect execution. The only flaw I encountered with DK's basic movement was when climbing on steep terrain. Sometimes the game gets confused with whether DK should be walking or climbing and will rapidly switch between the two when scaling a steep incline. This is most common with terrain you've created yourself, such as the seeds from Forest Layer or to a lesser extent the liftoff ore from Resort Layer and below. When this does happen, it tends to be a minor annoyance rather than a clear flaw, though it can be a little frustrating when you're navigating over a pit. The Pit Seeds Puzzle Ruins is a good example. DK can also punch forward, up, and down, roll, jump, spin jump, dive, grab terrain, ride on terrain, and use terrain for a double jump. Rolling can destroy terrain in your path, and if you roll into a jump, you'll travel further. You can grab terrain, jump, turf surf, jump off the terrain, roll, and punch to cover a huge amount of distance. If you jump and roll into a wall, you'll bounce off, but if you jump, roll, and then punch into a wall, you'll grab on and start climbing. You can swim, but only on the surface. If you dive into water, you'll go a little deeper and can reach collectibles underneath. There's also the Bananzas, but we'll get to those a little later. You might notice some similarities to Odyssey's movement. The developers clearly worked very hard to refine the actual game feel as much as possible because controlling DK feels better than controlling Mario. I replayed Odyssey before Bananza released, and the movement does feel excellent, but after going back to collect some specific footage for the video, I realized that Mario isn't as responsive as DK, especially when navigating in the air. Between the tighter control scheme of Bananza and the heavier lean on motion control inputs in Odyssey, it's simply easier to get DK to do exactly what you want him to do.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that Odyssey's movement is more complex, because Bananza's movement is heavily influenced by what terrain you have access to.
There's rubber that you can bounce off, the aforementioned liftoff ore that can be used as a deteriorating hot air balloon, you can throw different types of soft terrain to create bridges or pillars to climb, and of course there are numerous ways that you can generate terrain. Movement and terrain are tightly linked in Bananza, just as it is to exploration. In Super Mario 64, you can move forward, right, left, and backward. If you're near water, you can go down. And if you have the wing cap upgrade, you can reach platforms you would otherwise not be able to access. But all your exploration is limited by terrain. Because Bananza is comprised entirely of voxels, that limitation doesn't exist. You can explore forward, right, left, backward, downward, upward, in the walls, outside of the walls, on top of floating islands, inside floating islands, underneath floating islands, and everywhere and anywhere in between. Even Breath of the Wild doesn't compare, and that game was a massive step forward in freedom of exploration. Only Tears of the Kingdom could possibly rival Bananza's movement, and even that was limited by resources like Zonite and energy cells. Both Zelda games can be pretty overwhelming when trying to explore thoroughly. There is so much to do and collect in any direction, and it's very easy to miss stuff along the way. You would think that Bananza would be just as overwhelming, if not more so, but the developers made 3 choices that mitigate how much there is to explore. First of all, because DK's base movement speed is static, whether he's running or climbing, general traversal speed is just really fast. There is terrain that slows you down, but overall it's a small impact. Second of all, the developers have placed hints in the level design to suggest something is hidden in the terrain. It's very similar to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. If I saw something that made me think there might be something hidden there, I was usually right. Finally, DK's hand slap ability is a radar pulse that outlines collectibles, chests, and ruin entrances that you can't see as long as they're within range, and the radar can be upgraded to increase that range. Once I was used to the game, I was smashing this button every couple seconds until I slowly started to notice patterns that clued me into whether collectibles are likely nearby or not, and even then I would still hand slap pretty frequently, and I think most players will be the same. It's such an easy button to press at pretty much any moment, and it's heavily incentivized by the fact that it collects gold, Banandium chips, health, and music discs. Just like how you're never more than 6 feet from a spider, you're also never far from a collectible in Bananza. It leads to a cycle of exploration similar to catching Pokemon in Legends Arceus. You enter a flow where you move from collectible to collectible with very little downtime. It's like elegant and organized destruction. It's a fantastic gameplay loop, and it's made all the better by superb visual and auditory feedback. In his video titled Damage Animations, Masahiro Sakurai explains the concept and importance of a hit stop, which is an animation design choice typically associated with fighting games. It's a style of animation meant to give visual feedback that complements the corresponding audio. Hit stops can create a strong sense of collision, especially when models have a hitbox that do not match the visuals, for example Ike's sword moving through Bowser. Bananza makes liberal use of hit stops when interacting with both terrain and enemies. That, in combination with excellent sound design, provides a remarkable game feel. Basically every time you smash or grab something, DK's model freezes for a frame or two. The screen shakes and the terrain breaks in a hit-stopped animation. This is not to be confused with frame drops, which do happen but are very rare and unintrusive. The stronger the terrain, the meatier the animation is, with a satisfying sound effect to top it off. Dirt and sand offer no resistance, and the visual feedback is minimal. Crystal and gold break with ease and are carried by their shattering sound effect. Rock and concrete are chunky with a strong crunch. The screen shakes a lot, and DK's model freezes for longer than usual. Every type of terrain has a very effective level of feedback, both visually and auditorily. Even the Banandium gems are satisfying to break. But the best feedback comes with combat. Almost every enemy is covered in terrain armor. Once it's broken down, the mobs only take one hit, and they're sent flying and collide with whatever is in their path. Some enemies do slightly different things when they're launched, like the Rolliscoid that will rapidly roll along and up any terrain it comes into contact with.
Regardless of what the enemy does, there's a very impactful hit stop upon contact with the mob, and when the mob slams into the terrain, which will often crack or break on impact. It's incredibly satisfying, and gives combat a serious punch.
Bananza has a pretty novel take on combat, tying it directly to the destruction mechanic. It's great for outlining how unique the game really is. Unfortunately, I'm very conflicted on combat as a whole. Half of my experience was awesome and played very well into the core gameplay loop, but the other half was downright disappointing. This video has been extremely positive so far, and that's because Donkey Kong Bananza is a considerable improvement on the Nintendo framework I discussed, but it's not perfect. In general, combat is very well done when fighting regular enemies. Due to the terrain, every battle has a puzzle or platforming element, even if it's as simple as smash its armor. There's a lot of enemy variety too. Crocoids are the most common enemy and always wield a cudgel. Their armor and weapon can be all different terrain types, requiring a different response to each encounter. Anticoids will always leave a spherical piece of terrain behind when they're defeated. Molovoids are small moving platforms that burrow underground. They will take on the terrain type that they emerge from, and will often have a drill pop out to prevent quick kills. There are close to 20 different types of enemies in Bananza, all with a unique function. Ruin combat challenges often mix enemy mechanics with a puzzle or platforming twist. One particular ruin with munchoids and rubber terrain was actually quite challenging for me. Many of them can be tricky, especially because they are all timed. Everything surrounding regular enemies and ruin challenges is the great half of combat. It's the bosses that were a disappointment. But to properly discuss why this is, we need to finally talk about the Bananzas. There are 5 Bananza animal forms in the game. Each one is additive to DK's basic moveset, which means that you can do all the same moves in a Bananza as you can when not, with one very small exception. This is a big change from Mario Odyssey, in which almost all the possession power-ups replaced Mario's moveset almost entirely. Kong Bananza is really just a stronger version of DK. He can break sturdier terrain, charge his punches, and create a shockwave. Zebra Bananza is, in my opinion, the weakest of the bunch. You can run faster and can traverse terrain that would otherwise break beneath you along with running on water. There's a charge dash that can break terrain in front of you but is very hard to control, and your ability to throw terrain is improved. Ostrich Bananza lets you fly horizontally for a short time leading into a glide and drop egg bombs. It's arguably the most universally useful animal form, but the design creeps me out. It's those hands. Elephant Bananza allows you to inhale almost any type of terrain, including damaging terrain like lava, and store it to create spheres of terrain to use as you need. It also has my favorite animal form design in the game, but that might just be because the elephant is one of my son's favorite animals. Snake Bananza is weird. It's the only form that replaces a piece of DK's moveset. Instead of running, you'll bounce around. This might seem like it's not a big deal, but you move slower and you have less immediate control over the direction you're moving. You can just roll though, which I did a lot. Otherwise, your jump becomes a charge jump, and you can use another charge jump in midair for a powerful double jump. You can then follow that up with an extremely powerful meteor punch to slam into the ground. Snake mode also has glare, which slows time around you. Very useful for certain combat and platforming challenges. The Bananzas are a lot more like Zelda items than Mario power-ups. You constantly use them for platforming, and they are essential for a large amount of the game's puzzles, and you'll even be switching between them fairly often. I found myself in an animal form for the majority of the time the further into the game I got, and it's pretty easy to basically always have enough Bananergy to transform. Yes, that's what it's called. Between the already robust base moveset and the vast expansion provided by the Bananzas, DK's kit is incredibly versatile. Almost too versatile. In most cases, the only thing preventing you from getting to a certain location or reaching a certain collectible is hard limitations like unbreakable terrain. The bosses do not stand a chance against DK's kit, and as such are way too easy, and they take like 30 seconds to beat. This is a problem from the very first boss all the way to the very last boss. There are ways to make the game more difficult, we'll talk about that later, but the bosses are not helped very much by them, which is a huge shame because basically every boss is very unique and uses terrain and destruction in very creative ways. The biggest problem is actually Bananza's boss arena design. They're almost all in huge, wide open spaces with effectively infinite terrain to use and whatever resources you could possibly need. DK is already extremely versatile. He's fast, can climb with basically no limitation, including on the boss, and has effectively infinite terrain to work with. And that's just DK's regular form. The Bananzas compound the issue by greatly expanding DK's mobility. You might think that if the bosses are too easy, then just don't use the Bananzas, and that would make them slightly more difficult, but some bosses do require a specific animal form. The reason some of the combat ruins can pose a decent challenge is because the arena design is often very restrictive and intentionally designed. They're puzzle and platforming challenges alongside combat challenges. The bosses, as unique and creative as they are, do not have intentionally designed settings. Some are better than others, but they pretty much all have this issue. The last boss of Canyon Lair is a good example. It's a giant version of the Stompoids, and the fight takes place in a large arena. The The boss is really simple. You have to avoid his stomps, smack his foot until he falls, and then attack the head. Even when not using Kong Bananza, his foot is very easy to break, and there's nothing in the environment to slow you down or get in your way. DK moves way too fast for the boss's attacks to actually hit, and even if you do get hit, there's plenty of healing around the arena. Now, this is still pretty early in the game, it's only the 3rd layer after all, but the later bosses don't get much more difficult. In the freezer layer, you'll take on Poppy Kong. She speeds around the arena, and you have to use the snow to see where she's going. Make contact with her to stun her, and then slam her with damage. You can use Zebra mode to catch her more easily, but it's not necessary. In the Radiance layer, you'll take on Poppy for a 2nd time. This refight is identical to the first time you fight her, aside from the fact that the game requires you to use Snake Bananza's glare to slow time around her. She travels just as fast as in the first fight, and you can catch her in DK's regular form without much trouble, but she'll just dodge until you use glare. It's really weird to me that the refight, which I would expect to be harder, requires you to use an ability that makes the fight easier. Sure, the game doesn't require you to slow down time in the first round, it doesn't even require you to speed up with Zebra Bananza, but glare is easy to use and lasts for a long time. Chasing Poppy around is more challenging, it's also more fun, but the game doesn't let you do that. I assumed this was the way the game decided to teach me about glare in an unavoidable way, but that doesn't even track. There are no other bosses in the game that require glare's usage, and there was already a tutorial for using glare in platforming, so why couldn't I just run around and slam into Poppy the way I did in Freezer Layer? Which leads me to my next issue with the bosses, the ratio of unique bosses to refights. There are 19 boss fights in Donkey Kong Bananza, but 7 of them are refights, and each one only has a minor mechanic or terrain changes. Like Poppy, they're all almost identical. Regular enemies have significantly more variety than the bosses that are supposed to be mechanical understanding and skill checks, and it's the regular enemies that have the most challenge in the game as well. This certainly isn't the first game with much harder regular mobs than bosses, but it really is very disappointing because the developers clearly knew how to make the game hard, but they just looked at the bosses and didn't.
But there is a boss rush mode in the post-game, so surely the bosses have an optional hard mode, right? Right? Not really. There are terrain changes that make them a little harder, but it's not that different. In fact, this is the difficulty that I think the original fights should have been. And it's not even every boss in the game.
Like I said earlier, this is a huge shame. The boss fights in Bananza are incredibly unique due to the voxel technology, and some of them are incredible spectacles. The Forest Layer boss arena is the entire zone, which is really cool and feels very epic. Then the first time you fight Void Kong takes that to another level and is spread across multiple layers. The last boss is one of the coolest fights I've ever seen in a game, and it's actually substantially harder than any other boss. Emphasis on the it's still pretty easy overall. And this seems so easy to fix, at least for me. Just design the boss arenas the same way the combat ruins are designed. Puzzle platforming in combination with boss battles. The boss rush arenas are a good start, but the developers could go even further without making the game too difficult. But that's the thing, isn't it? The developers don't want the game to be too difficult. They want it to be enjoyable and accessible by adults and kids alike. If the bosses are too hard, that might dissuade young fans, though I have to say, kids are good at video games, and I wouldn't underestimate their ability to beat a game like Bananza, even with harder boss fights. It doesn't have to be Elden Ring. The bosses in Mario Odyssey are already a good bit harder than in Donkey Kong Bananza. But this is a good segue into how Nintendo decided to handle difficulty in Bananza. So let's talk about Koroks, moons, and bananas.
Oh, banana.
One of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong. Leave a comment with which you think is different and why. Oh, and if you've enjoyed this so far, hit the like button and consider subscribing. Time's up! The odd one out for the purposes of this argument is the Power Moon. When you collect a Korok in Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, you are working toward expanding equipment space in your inventory. When you collect a Banandium gem in Donkey Kong Bananza, you are working toward a skill point. When you collect a Power Moon in Mario Odyssey, you are working toward
nothing.
Well, okay, it's not quite nothing. You're working toward unlocking the next level, but the point is that finding collectibles in modern Zelda games in Bananza provides a gameplay benefit, and while I'm using Koroks and Banandium gems for this explanation, Spirit Orbs and Lights of Blessing from the Zelda games along with fossils from Bananza fit as well. This is important because it makes collecting feel better in the latter games, but just because they feel better to collect doesn't mean they have any worthy function. In the cases of both Zelda games and Bananza, these collectibles allow the customization of the game's difficulty. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom wear this on their sleeve by having a very simple upgrade system. Koroks increase your options in combat while reducing the amount of inventory management required. Spirit Orbs and Lights of Blessing increase the number of hearts and stamina you can have. You don't need either to beat the game, but the more you upgrade, the easier the game gets. Bananza disguises its difficulty customization with a skill tree and clothing options. I'll start with fossils because they're the more straightforward of the two. You use fossils to buy clothing that has various bonuses. In general, you can expect each piece of clothing for both DK and Pauline to fall into one of three categories: reducing damage taken, increasing movement options, or allowing more access to Bananza forms. It's funny that the Bananzas have limited durations because it's very easy to gear yourself to always have access to a full bar of Bananergy, and when you transform into a Bananza, you can immediately refill your Bananergy within seconds. The energy bar is basically a non-issue, but it's important that it's there regardless. We'll talk more about that in just a bit. Banandium gems, on the other hand, provide skill points, and this is where the game's difficulty options are disguised the most. On its face, this is a meaningful skill tree with many substantial slots that actually alter your gameplay. While there are some skills with minor stat increases like health and punch effectiveness, most directly impact both DK's base moveset and those of the Bananzas. Despite this, their actual function is not to create a custom gameplay experience for the player, it's to make the game easier. Skills like Better Turf Surf increase the amount of time DK can ride on terrain for longer, allowing for more mistakes. Glide allows for Ostrich mode to cover more distance in the air, reducing the precision needed for platforming challenges, and I could list plenty of other examples. You're not creating a unique build in Donkey Kong Bananza, you're making decisions that make certain parts of the game easier, and of course, it's totally reasonable to fill every skill slot to nearly max level before the end of the main story. And remember, DK's base moveset is extremely powerful on its own, so it's also totally reasonable to beat the entire game without using a single skill point, though it would be pretty hard. In a way, the game has an easy mode, that being assist mode, normal mode, and any number of self-imposed challenge modes built into the game. The game even encourages it with the ability to reset your skill tree very early on into the game. At this point, you might be thinking, well duh, Two Dens, any skill tree in any game is just meant to make that game easier. This is very nitpicky. And you'd be right, but there's a big difference between a skill tree in a game like Bananza, in which you're kinda meant to unlock every skill in the game eventually, and a skill tree in an RPG in which you can build a character and have many unique ways to play, especially if there are actual story choices that can be made based on that customization. Bananza's skills are ultimately just difficulty options in disguise, but I do actually like the choice. More options is exclusively good, and it's better than it being in a weird menu that has, like, a zebra running speed slider. By the way, while the game disguises the difficulty modes as skill trees, the developers were actually pretty straightforward about what they are. There's a moment in Hollow Knight when you will inevitably encounter a pit. You've already traveled so deep, likely including having to navigate the horror of the Deep Nest. You might wonder how much deeper you could possibly go, what secrets could possibly be hidden beneath you. Despite the fear, you might find yourself wanting to jump. There's a similar moment in Tears of the Kingdom that you're likely to encounter early in the game. You'll encounter a pit with a malignant ooze seeping out and realize that you're intended to dive down into it. You'll fall and fall and fall until you realize that there is an entire Hyrule-sized map beneath the world filled with horrors and secrets for you to explore. And while the depths as a whole doesn't live up to the initial curiosity and terror it instills in you, it's a moment meant to capture your imagination, right alongside the first time you encounter a dragon in Breath of the Wild, and when you first see Ruined Kingdom in Mario Odyssey. The concept of the depths is certainly not new to video games, or even just media as a whole. Even Pokémon has explored the topic in Area Zero, as have many other games. We as humans are fascinated by things we don't understand, and the depths are a prime example. There's a common adage that we know more about outer space than we do the bottom of the ocean, and they're both equally as Lovecraftian.
So when I saw that Donkey Kong Bananza is about diving deep into the planet's core and exploring deep and forgotten worlds, I was immediately sold. I love this stuff.
And the game does not disappoint. Every new layer was a rush of exploration and wonder, each with a unique theme and plenty of new mechanics and terrain to play around with. Nintendo knew that this world would spark a lot of curiosity in people, and they went hard on it. Everything from the Fractone plaques documenting the journey of the Exploratone deep into the core to the specific recipes of the Freezer Layer's ice cream shop. I was super invested and wanted to learn more and more about this world. Nintendo blew the sense of discovery and exploration out of the water in the same way they did with Breath of the Wild, if not better. Nintendo put serious thought into their world building. There were questions that I had throughout basically the whole game regarding how this world works that actually got answered, and I very much did not expect them to do so because Nintendo usually just doesn't. Even the story and character building got more attention than it usually does at Nintendo, and especially in regard to Mario and Donkey Kong games. And while Pauline is no Zelda, she's got a lot of charm, and I found myself really rooting for her. The writers gave her a lot of personality that comes through especially when you sleep in the hidden refuges, and I really like that by the time you get the last Bonanza, she's become confident when singing to a crowd. But while the world building is incredible and the story is at least okay, the layers themselves vary dramatically in their quality. Some are bursting with content, while others range from intriguing but ultimately disappointing to completely baffling, making me wonder why they are even in the game. During my playthrough, I realized there are two types of layers. I call them full layers and interlude layers. Full layers are just what they sound like, complete experiences. Loads of challenges, new mechanics, multiple sublayers, a self-contained mini-story, and multiple boss fights. They're also huge. Interlude layers are shorter, usually only have one sublayer or none at all, have maybe one boss fight, and are very contained. There are 15 layers in Donkey Kong Bananza that lead up to the ending. There are more, but we'll talk about those in the final spoiler section. Of those 15, 1 is a tutorial layer and can't be returned to until later, and 6 are interlude layers, and some of those are incredibly shallow. Now before we get into this, I want to be fair. Even some of the smaller interlude layers are bigger than most Mario Odyssey kingdoms, and the full layers could fit multiple kingdoms inside them. In fact, most sublayers are the size of a kingdom in and of themselves, in the sense of both space and content. Well, except for one, but we'll get to that. On paper, there is nothing wrong with an interlude layer. The full layers really are massive and take a while to get through, and they're very chaotic to boot. Having a shorter, more relaxed layer in between designed to teach you a specific mechanic or introduce a new type of terrain isn't necessarily a bad thing.
The problem is the ratio between full layers and interlude layers. Like I said, there are 6 interlude layers out of the 15 for the majority of the main story, so Nintendo would be silly to move from one interlude layer to another, right?
Ingot Isle Cave-In is the tutorial layer, and it's strictly designed to introduce you to the basic mechanics. There's really not much to do, but it won't seem like that at first due to how destructible everything is. I'd be willing to bet you'll want to dig as much as possible as you unearth lots and lots of gold. Lagoon Layer is a unique take on a water level. It's a scrap fishing operation based around a sunken cargo ship. This is where you'll probably realize just how big these levels are once you open the map and notice the sublayers. While this is the first full layer, it's still very much filled with tutorials. It introduces different terrain types, fossils and clothing options, ruins, your first Bonanza, and it hints at what is possible when the voxel technology interacts with combat. Then we come to Hilltop Layer, which is the first interlude. It introduces the Fractones, teaches you about multiple mechanics that you have had access to since the beginning but may not have realized, and just gives you a small sandbox to mess around in while you find bananas and fossils. There's also a really cool and nostalgic ruin with a very well hidden extra banana. With all that said, if you want to go straight to the next layer, you can get there within a couple minutes so long as you have enough gold to pay the toll. Canyon Layer immediately returns to sprawling sublayers that just keep going. It's a little harder than Lagoon Layer and has way more hidden. There's minecarts, spires to climb, and just so many secrets in the terrain. Then there's the Divide, which is as interlude gets. It introduces the swapping ooze terrain, which is neat, and gives you the option to go right with vines or left with ice. There's a few bananas, but it would be easy enough to complete this layer within 15 minutes or so. Both Forest and Freezer layers are massive and content-rich. They both introduce a Bananza and have their own little story. I also want to shout out how goofy and creative these settings are. Forest Lair is a big resort run by ostriches, and it's got that Stickerbush symphony goodness. Freezer Lair is a giant ice cream stand, and all the zebras go bruh. Once you clear one of the previous 2 layers, you'll fall into the Junction, which is another interlude layer with basically nothing in it, though it's very important to the story. Only half of the Junction will be available to you, so you'll need to go finish the other layer before progressing further. After the Junction is Resort Layer. Thematically, it's really cool, and it introduces the Liftoff Ore, or Rainbow Terrain as I call it, but I quickly realized that it's another interlude layer right after the Junction. It's about the same size as Hilltop Layer, and it's almost just as quick. Once again, if you want to go straight to the end, it's a pretty quick process. It was pretty fun to smash through the giant watermelon, and I appreciate how it gave me health as I did. Neat touch. Tempest Layer is next, and it's again a complete experience, and a really cool one at that. There's lots of new terrain, a new Bananza, and the game starts to get pretty challenging at this point. Even the boss is hard. Now we get to Landfill Lair, and I was immediately intrigued. This is simultaneously one of my favorite layers and also one of the most disappointing. It has a totally different vibe from any previous layer. It's claustrophobic, the music is quiet and eerie, and there seems to be very little life, at least until you find Trashtopia. It immediately reminded me that we are deep beneath the surface, and that's compounded by the fact that there's just so much to dig through. There's a good bit to uncover as well, but once I opened the map I realized that it's another interlude layer. There's barely 30 minutes of content, and that's being generous. And if you just follow the intended path, you could be done with this layer within a few minutes. This was such a disappointment for me because it was a perfect opportunity for the developers to really drive home how deep you are. This is a landfill. Make it so there's 3 sublayers worth of trash to dig through. Make some areas so dense that they can't be smashed, requiring DK and Pauline to navigate subtunnels, fighting off surprise enemies, encountering platforming sections, and having to navigate the dark depths. Instead, it's a glorified pile of dirt that you just keep digging through until you fall through the floor. I just don't get it! And then the game drops us into Racing Layer, and oh boy, does this level suck! This layer consists of like 10 bananas and 1 race, 2 if you come back in the post-game. The race itself is really bare bones as well. You only race against Diddy and Dixie. The track is really boring too. There are 3 types of terrain: mud that slows you down, blue dirt that Rambi can eat to gain energy, and gold which pretty much instantly fills Rambi's bar. Then you can use Rambi's energy to generate rainbow terrain, which acts as a speed boost and a launch pad. It's not a terrible minigame, it's just so brief. You won't find anything on the other floating islands, and you can smash through the giant trophy, but there's nothing there. Just microscopic amounts of gold. And that's it. There's nothing else to this layer.
This is honestly pathetic. Why is this a layer? This should be a tiny minigame within a larger layer, not an entire layer in itself. It's just like the Ruined Kingdom in Odyssey. It feels like cut content. In fact, so does Landfill Layer.
At least the Divide and Junction were clearly meant to be transitional levels. The Divide gives you a choice, though it doesn't actually matter, and the Junction is a story flashpoint with a really cool boss fight. At least Hilltop and Resort have some lesser but substantial content, but the Racing Layer just feels incomplete, and unfortunately, it's not the end of this trend. Fortunately, the next level is Radiance Layer, and it's one of the best in the game. There's a number of new mechanics, some great world building that actually gives in-universe answers to why there's so much light underground, which I had been wondering about since the beginning of the game, and we get the final Bananza. It also has one of the most interesting boss fights, requiring to use Snake Bananza to open up sunlights in the ceiling to break Grumpy Kong's unbreakable armor. I just wish the implementation was a little more thought out. Grumpy often just hangs around and moves just out of any sunlit areas. It's not hard, of course, just a little frustrating. Then we get Groove Layer, which is the most interesting level from a gameplay perspective because it takes away the ability to use Bananza forms. The truth is, this is another interlude layer, but it gets a pass because the lack of animal forms requires a lot of puzzle solving by paying attention to and using your environment. And it introduces the harp mechanic, which switches terrain back and forth between 2 options. This leads to some really challenging puzzles later on in the game. The layer also ends in a banger. Feast layer surprised me, because at first I thought it was another interlude layer. There wasn't a huge enemy presence, it seemed to be another hub for the Fractones, and the map appears pretty small. But this definitely isn't the case. Feast layer is actually the longest and densest layer in the game. It's just structured differently than any previous level. It's also a pretty strong capstone before the very end of the game. The platforming sections and puzzles are appropriately challenging. Every Bananza is used in multiple ways, and there's just a ton to do. It's also uncomfortably thematic. I actually felt grimy while playing because you're essentially running around a fast food kitchen in the form of a theme park. I could feel the grease coursing through my veins, and climbing up and digging through the burger was just weird. Very creative though. This whole time, I've been using the terms full layer and interlude layer, but that's just the way I found myself thinking about them because the latter tends to be quicker levels that break up the length and density of the former. The reality is certain layers had a lot more thought and effort put into them than others, and that does leave me wanting more, especially in cases like landfill and racing layers. There could be any number of reasons for this. Maybe there were budgetary or time limitations. Maybe the developers just couldn't figure out how to make some of the quicker levels substantial in a meaningful way. Who knows? It's rare for me to want more from a game. Usually when I've reached the end of the game, I'm ready for it to be done, so I can move on to something else. But Donkey Kong Bananza joins games like Hollow Knight and Elden Ring in settings and worlds that were so compelling it left me wishing I could keep exploring and discovering new areas and lore, and it's all supported by a truly excellent gameplay experience.
So at this point, I need to give you another spoiler warning. In the next section, I'm going to talk in detail about the ending of Bananza, along with these other games. I'm going to again implore you, if you haven't played Bananza or haven't finished it and you intend to someday, stop watching this video. This is going to hurt this video's retention, but the ending really does have a couple moments that are just fantastic, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone. Yet I also really want to discuss it because I think Nintendo has a really unique take on video game endings. So in case you don't want to be spoiled, I really hope you enjoyed this. Please consider leaving a like and subscribing, and thank you so much for watching. If you want to continue, let's move on.
Another trend that started at the beginning of the Switch era is something I found myself calling the Nintendo ending. From my point of view, these endings all have at least two of the following three traits. A moderately challenging test of mechanics, usually coupled with a tough boss, an easier, usually cinematic boss with an incredibly large scale, and a celebration or homage to the series' roots. I obviously haven't played every game in the Nintendo-owned franchises, but I've played enough to notice this trend. Breath of the Wild was the first and has Calamity Ganon leading into Dark Beast Ganon, and that fits all three traits. Mario Odyssey has the Bowser fight, which isn't hard, but probably is the toughest fight in the game, and then there's the part where Mario possesses Bowser and they smash through the center of the moon to a Taylor-written tune. Tears of the Kingdom has a tricky duel with Ganondorf into a crazy battle between two celestial dragons, and it's literally Link and Dragon Zelda in battle with Dragon Ganondorf like it's the end of flippin' Wind Waker. Fire Emblem Engage has a decently challenging final chapter on a cosmic scale where the characters all fight spiritual representations of many antagonists throughout the series, and then fight the dragon to end all dragons. That might sound really epic, but the game's story sucked.
But I wanted to be a good dragon.
Kirby and the Forgotten Land starts with a genuinely hard boss fight, and then has Kirby inhale a truck and smash into an eldritch god while the world ends around them. And if you recognize the song that's been playing in the background, you know exactly why I picked it. While not every Nintendo game has an ending that lives up to these examples, the point is that the company has been intentional about making their endings exciting, emotional, and above all memorable. And Donkey Kong Bananza is no exception. As I descended into the Forbidden Lair, I honestly found myself struck. Where am I? What the heck is this place? Why do I care so much about the lore in this Monkey Banana game? This is going to sound ridiculous, but it made me think of, I kid you not, Interstellar, like I'm on the precipice of an event horizon. Gosh, I love when games and other media do this. We're so deep that things start getting weird, abstract. The world building is on point too. The Fractones here want nothing to do with us. They keep saying take the hint and telling us to leave. Even the plaques say the same thing. The game does a really good job of communicating that something dangerous is down here, maybe even something wrong, something that should not be awoken. There's that Lovecraftian subtext I mentioned earlier. The new mechanic is also really interesting. Once I pay the giant fractones, a force field is generated. Anytime I throw a piece of terrain within the field, fractone terrain is created in an arc. If the field rotates or moves in any way, so does the suspended terrain. So I need to account for this as I'm creating more arcs. But now we're going to finally talk about gating. Unlike Moons in Odyssey, Bananza doesn't use bananas to gate your progress in any way. Instead, it uses gold. But up to this point, the amount of gold needed to progress is so little that you would never have to really worry about it. However, in order to activate the force fields in Forbidden Lair, you need to pay the giant fractones around 10 to 15,000 gold to make it to the end of the level. If you don't have that much, you need to farm it. You probably will have enough though, especially if you've been doing a lot of exploring and using your hand slap ability liberally. I really like this level, but unfortunately, it's another interlude layer. It's incredibly short, and the force field is a criminally underutilized mechanic. Given how mysterious Forbidden Lair is, I again found myself wishing there was more to see. So now we're up to 16 layers, 7 of which are interludes. That's not great for the ratio. In fact, a large section of this layer is dedicated to the final Void Kong boss fight, and there's nothing really to explore after the battle is over. Speaking of the boss, it's another refight, but it uses a number of the newer mechanics and terrain, and is probably the hardest boss up to this point. Once again, emphasis on the est, not the hard. Donkey Kong Bananza is one of those games that kinda just keeps going. There are multiple points throughout the game that I believe the developers intended you to feel like the end of the game was coming. The Junction is the first instance of this. You've caught up with Void Company and their giant meteor, and there's a huge boss fight with Void Kong in which you revisit all of the layers you've been to. With that said, all you have to do is look at the skill tree to see how much of the game hasn't been experienced yet. The next point would probably be Groove Layer. Pauline being kidnapped is an acceleration of the rising action, and the layer itself is so different than anything you've seen up to this point. I was genuinely expecting to move into the end of the game when I jumped into the Harmonial.
Then we get to Forbidden Lair, and it definitely feels like the end. It's foreboding and alien, the fractones act differently, and you smash through many layers of concrete to go into a final battle with Void Kong, the primary antagonist of the entire game. All right in front of what everyone is calling the Banandium route. But again, the developers did this on purpose.
That's right, King K. Rool is back, and boy, what a reveal it was. I genuinely had no idea this was going to happen. I was just wondering if this was really the end. In the moment, I thought this came out of nowhere, but upon reflection, it's actually subtly hinted at throughout the entire game. All of the Void-controlled enemies throughout the entire game are golden skeletons depicting crocodiles, bees, armadillos, and other animals that have been recurring mobs throughout the Donkey Kong series. It's the Kremling crew, and after we descend into the planet core, the real final layer of the game, we see these enemies again, but this time fully rendered underneath all their armor. It's like the crew was being projected into the upper layers by the Banandium route. That's another really neat detail that really helps with world building. I honestly can't gush enough about this tiny detail, I just love it so much. Speaking of the planet core, the place is wild. The transition is wild. If Forbidden Lair was the event horizon, then the planet core is within it. It's creepy and incredibly fascinating. It has an immense sense of the unknown, of Lovecraftian curiosity. It really feels like we shouldn't be here. I was even more awestruck when I first opened the map. It's a spiral of islands leading deeper to the center of the core. It makes it seem like the planet core dwarfs any previous layer. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Each island is quite small and functions as a mechanical or combat challenge. It's more than an interlude layer, but it's not as vast as a full layer. Each island is like an individual ruin challenge that can actually get pretty tough, especially the Turf Surf Island. I was stuck trying to get a rare fossil for over 20 minutes. It took me so long and was so frustrating, I was starting to think I might still be a dodo bird. Difficulty aside, the planet core was disappointingly short. Even if I were to be generous and combine Forbidden Lair and Planet Core as one total level, which they're not, then it would still only equate to a moderately sized full layer. I don't know, this game is chock full of content, but it seems like they put so much effort into some layers, but then almost forgot about others. I would much rather just not have a racing layer if it potentially means a forbidden layer or planet core with more depth, pun intended. But it's time to set all this aside, because if planet core is inside the event horizon, then the Banandium route is the singularity. Okay, I'll stop. But hey, how is Cranky Kong here, and how did he get here before me? I want to ride his Rambi. King K. Rool is another really awesome boss. Because of DK's proximity to the Banandium route, you'll have infinite Banergy and therefore infinite Bonanza mode, which is important because you'll be switching between animal forms frequently. It's also an excellent use of terrain. K. Rool creates a lot of gold that you can use to stun him, allowing DK to go ham. I'm not gonna call it hard, but it's definitely more challenging than any previous boss in the game. I would normally say an easy way to make it extra challenging would be to beat it without the animal forms, but I don't think that would be hard per se. I think it would be miserable. The arena is so huge that you probably couldn't move fast enough to capitalize on any of the damage windows for more than a second, and on top of that, DK's punches would do less damage. I don't think you're even meant to try the boss without using the Bonanzas, but the developers at least left the option in for anyone who wants to.
Once King K. Rool is defeated, we are prompted to talk to the Banandium route. It provides a very deliberate, "Are you ready?" Like I'm about to fight God in a JRPG. Once you click yes, Pauline and DK's wishes are granted, and they are returned to the surface. The credits roll, and they live happily ever after.
Okay, it doesn't take a genius to predict that the game wasn't over, but I do appreciate the callback to the fake credits of the original Donkey Kong Country. This leads into the real finale, which starts with a fun set piece that isn't hard, but that's okay. It fits with the Nintendo ending. If this were where it ended, I would be happy, but Bonanza really takes the cake when it comes to these endings. Once DK, Pauline, and King K. Rool reach the surface, they arrive in New Donk City, which is a wonderful callback to Mario Odyssey that I had been suspecting we'd see throughout the whole playthrough. K. Rool takes control of the Banandium route and corrupts the city. There's a very flashy, yet also very simple platforming gauntlet that uses each of the Bonanzas in their own little sections. It's easy, but again it fits with the part of Nintendo finales with larger scale but lower difficulty. This would have been a perfect opportunity to reintroduce the limited Banergy though. That would have increased the difficulty of this section a good bit, but I also felt okay with it because it's definitely a celebration of both the Donkey Kong series along with Mario Odyssey. Which is why I was pleasantly surprised when the final boss with a rot-empowered K. Rool was even harder than the first time. I'm still not ready to call it hard, however. The patterns are easy to recognize, and there's plenty of time to punch the cannonballs, which clears huge amounts of rotten gold. Elephant form also clears whatever is needed and provides infinite terrain to chuck at the boss. Still, the boss was definitely a grind. In a good way. Doing this without spending skill points would be really hard, and I mean really hard. Doing it without Bonanzas wouldn't be miserable, it would be torture. Overall, it was a fantastic final boss that managed to have substantial challenge, test the core mechanics of the game, and be a huge celebration of the Donkey Kong series. Before I finish up the video, I want to talk about the post-game because it's probably the best part of Bonanza. Nintendo made a big mistake with Odyssey's post-game by adding a huge amount of moons to every kingdom, requiring you to re-explore every area if you wanted to complete the game. It wastes your time and was a big personal pain point for me. It killed my motivation to go any further. Bonanza just doesn't do this. Collectibles are only added in new content, which includes Ingot Isle Cave-In as a proper layer, a boss rush which I mentioned earlier, and a set of Bonanza-specific puzzle and platforming challenges called rehearsals. Oh, and there's one banana added to racing layer if you do the race one more time. Great. The rehearsals are the main attraction of the post-game. They have a little story attached, with Pauline needing inspiration for a new song that she is going to perform at New Donk City Hall. Each one has a large amount of bananas to find, with each having a specific challenge attached. And let me tell you something, some of these are really hard. I again was starting to feel like I'm still a dodo bird. You need a total of 600 bananas eaten throughout the game to take part in the entirety of the postgame, which is easily achievable before you've even finished the main story. I really appreciate how this game respects your time. Each rehearsal is a real test of its respective animal form's mechanics. The game is clear that you need the skill trees for each Bananza filled out completely in order to beat these challenges, and while I'm sure speedrunners will figure out how to do it with as few skills as possible, I really felt like I was using every skill I had. The Kong rehearsal has you smashing terrain and brawling with enemies, and there's a particular puzzle that wants you to knock out some suspended mole enemies by knocking smaller enemies into them, and I just have no idea how to do this. Nothing I did seemed to work, though I do have the idea of rolling into the little guys to see if it would launch them, but I haven't had a chance to go back and test it as of writing this section of the script. The Zebra rehearsal is a bunch of timed platforming challenges, which range from relatively easy to incredibly tight. The Ostrich rehearsal is a huge open area with flapping and gliding platforming challenges along with some interesting puzzles. The Elephant rehearsal was full of puzzles mixed with combat that had me stumped for quite a while. It used the heart mechanic in a way that just bent my mind. In fact, I want to showcase this particular challenge that required me to lure one of the mole enemies off the main platform, switch the terrain, and then do a terrain double jump to kill the mole while on unsafe terrain. Very cool. Finally, the Snake rehearsal was probably the easiest of the bunch, but still had some really tricky platforming challenges that required precision and effective use of glare. Beating each rehearsal unlocks the final skill for each Bananza that uses their skills to turn any terrain around you into gold. This all leads up to a rehearsal with the Harmonial at the Banandium root. It's shorter and I would say easier than the rehearsals as a whole, but that's compensated for by the lack of checkpoints. I had to try multiple times and make sure I had as many life refills as possible to make it through. It's an awesome challenge that ends in an epic jam session with all the elders from the different layers. Once you beat this challenge, you'll get a second set of credits and the true ending. But if you don't want to be done, there's still 100% to achieve. While I didn't do this prior to writing the script, it's a totally reasonable process because the developers were very intelligent and built in systems to make the process faster the further in you go. By the end of the game, you'll have access to clothing options that make collecting gold, Banandium chips, and music discs much quicker. You can pay gold to find specific fossils and Banandium gems to finish off those collections, and then stack bonuses to collect the music discs as fast as possible.
I think Bananza is likely to join Breath of the Wild in being a game that shifts the gaming landscape. The developers took the framework that Nintendo has put so much emphasis on and worked to refine them. Movement is unmatched. Exploration is smoother than ever. Collection is more satisfying and serves a direct purpose, even if the skill points themselves are pretty meaningless. Voxel technology is used in really creative and fun ways. The puzzles were tricky, the platforming is demanding, the combat is crunchy and satisfying. I just wish the bosses had a bit more challenge. Oh, and the soundtrack is a can full of earworms. Donkey Kong Bananza isn't just a long-awaited new 3D Donkey Kong game. It's the culmination of Nintendo.
Hey, you made it to the end of the video. Leave a comment with your favorite layer in Bananza and why, and please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed this. On screen is another analysis video and a different video that you might like. Thank you so much for watching.